Picture a gas station with a handwritten sign taped to the pump, no fuel available, not in Kiev, not in a besieged Ukrainian town. This is Russia, more than 4 years into a war it started in a country that sits among the largest oil exporters on earth. Drivers are waiting in line for gasoline in a nation that ships crude oil to half the planet. This is not a rumor circulating on social media. In June 2026, Vladimir Putin himself acknowledged for the first time publicly that Russia was facing fuel shortages. Officials have confirmed rationing or restricted sales in more than 40 regions across the country. In some of those regions and in occupied Crimea, gasoline prices have climbed higher than what drivers pay at the pump in the United States. Sit with that for a moment. This is a state built on energy exports, a state whose entire war economy depends on oil revenue, and yet it cannot reliably fuel its own vehicles at home. So how does a country that exports fuel to the world end up rationing it domestically? The easy answer is sanctions. But sanctions have been in place for years, and they don't explain why this crisis is unfolding specifically now, in this form, at this intensity. What most people miss is that this isn't collateral damage. It isn't an accident of war or an unfortunate side effect of fighting on Ukrainian soil. It is beginning to look like the intended outcome of a strategy that has been building quietly and methodically for months. To understand how Russia arrived at rationing lines at home, we need to look at exactly what has been happening to its energy infrastructure since the start of the year. The shortages inside Russia did not appear overnight. They are the visible end result of a campaign that has been building since the early months of 2026, one that, reporting from Reuters, the Associated Press and the Financial Times, has independently tracked and confirmed as it escalated. At the center of this campaign is Ukraine's targeting of Russia's oil refining capacity. By the middle of the year, Ukrainian strikes had reportedly hit at least 8 of Russia's 10 largest refineries, in some cases more than once. This was not incidental damage from a broader offensive. President Volodymyr Zelensky has framed it explicitly, authorizing what has been described as a 40-day intensified operation carried out through Ukraine's security service, aimed squarely at military-industrial sites, logistics hubs, and energy infrastructure sustaining Russia's war effort. Running alongside that campaign is a second, more localized offensive. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, under the command of Robert Magyar Brovdy, have spent the first week of July striking dozens of power substations across occupied Crimea and parts of the Donbass. The result has been confirmed blackouts affecting Simferopol and other cities under Russian control, disrupting daily life in territory Moscow has spent years trying to present as stable and secure. It's worth pausing here on a point of discipline. Not every claim circulating about this campaign holds up. Some reports of specific strikes, casualties, or damage at named facilities have not been independently verified by major wire services. And a responsible account of this story means separating what is confirmed from what remains unconfirmed battlefield chatter. What is confirmed is enough on its own. Refineries, substations, storage depots, pipeline infrastructure. And on the other side, Russian regional authorities and Putin himself now managing a fuel crisis that didn't exist at this scale a year earlier, alongside retaliatory strikes against Kiev's own power grid. A reminder that this pressure runs in both directions. But here's the deeper issue. This isn't a string of isolated strikes carried out for symbolic effect. It's a coordinated campaign with a clear economic target. To understand why energy infrastructure became Ukraine's primary focus, we need to go back and look at how this kind of warfare has been used before by both sides. To understand why Ukraine is now targeting Russia's energy backbone, it helps to remember that this war has featured attacks on energy infrastructure from its earliest phases, but with a very different logic behind them. Beginning in October 2022, Russia launched a sustained campaign of missile and drone strikes against Ukraine's power grid. Waves of cruise missiles and loitering munitions struck substations, power plants, and transmission infrastructure across the country, timed deliberately to coincide with the onset of winter. The strategic intent, as understood by Ukrainian officials and Western analysts alike, was psychological as much as military. Deprive millions of Ukrainians of heat and electricity during the coldest months, and use that hardship to erode public morale and pressure Kiev toward capitulation. The UK Ministry of Defence and NATO officials at the time described the campaign in stark terms, and it drew international condemnation. The strategy did real damage. It did not, by most independent assessments, achieve its underlying political objective. Ukrainian resolve did not collapse. If anything, the campaign hardened public and political will to continue resisting. It stands now as a case study in the limits of trying to win a war by breaking a population's spirit rather than its capacity to fight. Ukraine's current campaign against Russian energy infrastructure operates on a fundamentally different premise. This is not primarily about civilian morale. It is about capacity specifically, the economic and logistical capacity that sustains Russia's ability to keep fighting. That shift became possible only because Ukraine's own strike capability changed dramatically. In 2023 and 2024, Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian territory were limited, largely retaliatory, and constrained by range and payload. By 2025 and into 2026, that had changed. Expanded domestic drone manufacturing, combined with improved guidance systems, gave Ukraine the ability to strike targets hundreds of kilometers inside Russia with far greater consistency. Reporting has also indicated that American intelligence data has played a role in helping Ukrainian forces identify optimal flight paths and avoid Russian air defenses, extending the practical reach of these strikes even further. This is where everything changes. Once Ukraine could reliably reach deep into Russian territory, the entire logic of the war's energy dimension flipped. What had been, for Ukraine, a matter of surviving Russian strikes on its own grid became an opportunity to go on the offensive against Russia's oil economy, the refineries that convert crude into usable fuel, the storage depots that hold it, the export terminals like Novorossiysk that ship it abroad, and pipeline systems like Druzhba that move it across the region. This was no longer defensive retaliation. It was the beginning of a deliberate, systemic campaign aimed at Russia's economic capacity to sustain the war. With that history in mind, we can now examine what's really driving Ukraine's current strategy and why it goes far beyond simply damaging infrastructure. To understand why oil refineries have become such a central target, you have to look past the headlines and ask a more basic question. What actually funds a war of this scale, year after year, when the initial assumptions of a quick campaign collapsed long ago? For Russia, the answer is oil. Crude exports and refined petroleum products remain the country's largest source of externally generated revenue, the financial backbone that allows Moscow to sustain military spending even under years of sanctions. This is the detail that makes Ukraine's refinery campaign so significant. It is not simply about depriving Russian civilians of gasoline, though that is a visible and politically useful side effect. It is about attacking the revenue stream that funds the war itself without needing to defeat a single Russian brigade on the battlefield to do it. This is what analysts describe as an effects-based approach, and it becomes clearer once you see how deliberately layered the targeting has been. Striking refineries reduces the volume of crude that can be converted into exportable, revenue-generating product. Striking fuel depots and pipeline infrastructure does something different. It disrupts the logistics that keep Russian forces supplied, including reported strikes near facilities supporting the Engels bomber base, a hub tied to Russia's long-range aviation capability. And striking substations across occupied Crimea serves a dual function, punishing the administrative infrastructure of occupation, while sending an unmistakable signal that Ukrainian reach now extends into territory Moscow has spent over a decade trying to present as permanently secured. None of this would be possible at the current scale without a quieter development running underneath it, the intelligence and targeting infrastructure that makes precision strikes deep inside Russian territory repeatable rather than exceptional. Improved guidance systems mean fewer drones are needed to achieve meaningful damage. reported American intelligence assistance in identifying flight paths and gaps in Russian air defense coverage has, according to multiple reports, extended the effective range and reliability of these operations considerably. This is not simply a story about more drones. It is a story about better information. Here is where the public narrative and the strategic reality start to diverge. In the way this campaign is often described, Ukraine hitting back, Ukraine striking Russian targets, it can sound reactive, almost improvisational, a series of retaliatory gestures. The deeper reality looks quite different. This is a systematic campaign designed to erode Russia's capacity to sustain the war economically, operating on a timeline that is largely independent of what is happening along the front line. Ground movement can stall for months without this pressure slowing down at all. That decoupling is precisely what makes the strategy valuable to Kyiv. It also matters diplomatically. In any future ceasefire negotiation, leverage rarely comes only from territory held. It comes from what each side can credibly threaten to keep doing if talks fail. A sustained campaign capable of squeezing Russian fuel supply and export revenue gives Ukraine a form of leverage that doesn't depend on advancing a single kilometer on the ground, an asymmetric card that remains relevant even in scenarios where the front line has frozen. Russia, for its part, has not been without answers. Much of its ability to absorb this pressure so far rests on infrastructure redundancy inherited from the Soviet era, refining and grid systems originally built to serve far higher levels of industrial demand, with capacity to spare even after damage. Combine that with patchwork repair efforts, and Russia has, for now, avoided a full systemic collapse. But that isn't the most important development. The real story is what happens when Russia's Soviet-era redundancy finally runs out, when decades-old infrastructure, repeatedly struck and hastily repaired, no longer has spare capacity left to absorb the next wave. This strategic pressure doesn't stay contained within Russia's borders. It's already reshaping the wider war, and the reactions coming out of Moscow show just how seriously this is being taken. The consequences of this campaign are no longer confined to refinery yards and substation fences. They are showing up in everyday Russian life in ways the Kremlin cannot easily hide. Fuel prices in some Russian regions and in occupied Crimea have now climbed above what drivers pay at the pump in the United States, a striking reversal for a country that has long used cheap domestic energy as a point of national pride. The disruption extends beyond gas stations. Logistics networks dependent on refined fuel have been affected too, with reports of delayed food and goods deliveries reaching cities as far from the front line as St. Petersburg. For a government that has worked hard to project an image of wartime normalcy, full shelves, functioning cities, life carrying on as usual, these disruptions chip away at something more valuable than any single refinery: the narrative itself. The military dimension matters just as much. Sustaining defense against an expanding drone campaign is not free. Russian officials have reported intercepting tens of thousands of drones, and every interception draws on air defense systems, personnel, and resources that might otherwise be allocated to frontline operations. Even a largely successful defense carries a cost when it has to happen at this frequency, across this much territory, indefinitely. Moscow has not absorbed this quietly. Russia has intensified its own strikes on Kyiv, explicitly describing them as retaliation for Ukraine's energy campaign. This is worth sitting with, because it reveals something the term retaliation tends to obscure. This is not a story of Ukraine landing free hits on a passive opponent. It is an escalating exchange, with real costs and real casualties accumulating on both sides. That exchange is being watched closely well beyond Kyiv and Moscow. For Western governments weighing how long to sustain military and intelligence support to Ukraine, this campaign offers a data point that matters: evidence that Ukraine can impose meaningful, measurable costs on Russia, even in a period where frontline territory has barely moved. That has implications for how the war is perceived, not as a stalemate in every sense, but as a conflict where pressure can still be applied and felt, just along a different axis. None of this supports a simple story of victory. Ukraine has gained real leverage and demonstrated a strike capability few expected at this scale. But Russia, despite the strain, still retains substantial reserves, repair capacity, and the ability to absorb losses that would cripple a smaller economy. The clearest cost of this campaign is being paid by ordinary Russian civilians who face rising prices and disrupted supply chains they had no part in creating. And beyond both countries, global oil markets are quietly absorbing secondary effects of their own. The headlines call this retaliation. The underlying power shift tells a very different story. With the stakes this high on both sides, the next question is where this campaign goes from here, and there are several distinct paths this could take. Given everything we've traced so far, four broad trajectories seem plausible from here, though none of them is guaranteed, and the outcome will likely depend on decisions that haven't been made yet. The first is sustained attrition. In this scenario, Ukraine continues its incremental strikes on refineries and substations at roughly the current pace, while Russia continues its pattern of patchwork repairs and rationing measures. Neither side achieves a decisive rupture. The war settles further into a grinding economic contest that runs parallel to, but largely independent of, whatever is happening along the front line. It is not dramatic, but it is sustainable for both sides, at least for a while. The second is escalation. If Ukraine integrates heavier long-range weapons, including domestically produced ballistic and cruise missile systems, into this campaign, strikes could reach further and cause significantly more damage than current drone operations allow. That would almost certainly provoke a sharper Russian response, likely intensified strikes against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure in turn. This path raises the humanitarian stakes considerably on both sides, and it carries real risk of a broader escalation spiral that neither government fully controls once it begins. The third scenario involves negotiation. Sustained economic pressure, particularly if fuel shortages deepen and public frustration inside Russia grows, could push Moscow toward more serious engagement with ceasefire or negotiation frameworks. In this version, the energy campaign functions less as a knockout blow and more as leverage, a way of shaping the terms of eventual talks rather than forcing an outright military collapse. The fourth scenario is Russian resilience. It's possible that Moscow successfully rebuilds redundancy into its refining and distribution systems, diversifies how fuel reaches different regions, and absorbs the pressure without any meaningful shift in its war posture. If that happens, the strategic value of Ukraine's campaign would erode over time, even if individual strikes continue to succeed tactically. Each path carries its own risks and its own opportunities. Escalation raises civilian cost and the danger of spirals that outpace anyone's intentions. Attrition, while lower risk, can also exhaust the side conducting its sustained drone campaigns, require constant production, funding, and intelligence support, all of which are finite. And it's worth stating plainly that this entire strategy depends heavily on continued Western technological and intelligence assistance to Ukraine. Without it, the reach and precision that made this campaign possible in the first place would be difficult to sustain. Each of these paths leads somewhere very different, and the decisions made in the next few months in Kiev, in Moscow, and in Washington will determine which one we're actually heading toward. Return for a moment to that image we opened with, a gas station in Russia, a country that exports oil to much of the world, with a handwritten sign taped to the pump. It's tempting to treat that as a strange anomaly, an odd footnote in a much larger war. By now, it should be clear that it isn't. It is evidence of a strategy working roughly as intended. Ukraine did not need to break through Russian lines to make this happen. It needed refineries, substations, storage depots, and pipelines, and the reach, technology, and intelligence support to hit them repeatedly. In doing so, it has found a way to impose genuine economic costs on Russia without winning a single decisive ground battle. That is the real shift worth understanding here. The center of gravity in this war is no longer located exclusively along the front line. Part of it now runs through the energy value chain itself. Whether this translates into a meaningful strategic outcome or is eventually absorbed by Russian resilience and repair capacity remains genuinely unresolved. Both outcomes are still plausible, and anyone claiming certainty about which one wins out is getting ahead of the evidence. What can be said with more confidence is this: the terms of the contest have changed. The real war may no longer be fought only on the front line. It's being fought in fuel lines, in substations, and in refinery fires, hundreds of kilometers from where the soldiers are. And that changes how we should be measuring who is actually winning. So perhaps the question worth sitting with isn't simply who holds more territory, it's whether this war has become a contest of endurance as much as one of territory, and which side is actually built to last longer.